Endeavor horizons of the infinite. Endeavor to gaze into the void. By Elton Garr. The Endeavor's sensors were the cutting edge of lumina optics technology. The only people who would argue that they weren't the best were the executives at Nexa Corporation. But while Nexa's tools were excellent for spies, they couldn't give the breadth and depth of data that you got from lumina optics sensors. That was what made the small area of space in front of them so frustrating. It was about 3 astronomical units wide and completely empty. If one of Lumina Optics' ships hadn't disappeared in it, then no one would have any way to know it was here. What made the lack of data odd was that while people often spoke about space as empty, it never was. There was background radiation, quantum fluctuations, photons, dust, and more. But their scanners didn't pick up any of that. She even agreed with the captain's caution this time. One ship had already been lost to that thing, and there was no way to know if the Endeavor was any more likely to survive. But after scanning the anomaly from every angle and sending in 6 probes, they either needed to make a more active investigation or admit they wouldn't find anything and leave.
Regan, how close can you safely get us to the edge of the anomaly?
Tabitha asked, moving, so she was standing between the pilot and the ops station to better see the blackness on the view screen. There was nothing to see, but she was still drawn to it. The pilot tapped out something, and a faint green glow highlighted the edge of the anomaly. A computer projection on the screen, showing the area they had mapped, but while it wasn't as precise as one might like, it was useful.
There is no gravity, so assuming that the surface remains stable, I could get you close enough to reach out and touch it.
That shouldn't be necessary. Take us in to 25 kilometers,
Tabitha said.
On the way,
Regan said, typing the commands. She didn't need to be told to approach it slowly. She simply adjusted the thrusters so that the orbit got smaller. It took a half-hour to reach 25 kilometers, and that was about the time that Captain Watt walked onto the bridge, 15 minutes early for his shift like always. Commander Hester stood up, but no one else did. As far as Tabitha was concerned, that was a discipline problem. A good strong respect for the powerful and wealthy was vital to the running of any organization, and more so when the person, like Adrian, was weak. The only person with an excuse not to stand up was Regan. But Tabitha giving an order that the captain would tell them to ignore would hurt her authority and his.
So, is it as exciting as the last 3 shift changes?
Adrian asked.
The anomaly is still a near-perfect sphere. Our probes are still silent, and there is still no Hawking radiation or anything else for that matter. We just moved in to 25 kilometers. I suggest we attempt my plan while both shifts are here, so we can gather more data,
Tabitha said. The captain glanced around, but no one from Beta Shift had arrived yet except him. But she didn't really care about them. If the captain took command, then she could run the scans she wanted without being distracted.
I thought we decided that would require too much radioactive material,
the captain said.
We did. And you were right. But I had Mr. Vinnick find a solution. He cut the amount of radioactive material needed by almost 30%, and half of that can be irradiated sand. The half-life won't be long, but it shouldn't need to be.
That sand is used in our filtering system,
Adrian said, but there was no real resistance in his voice. Say what you wanted about the captain, and she had said most of it. He would listen, and even change his mind when he had new information.
I am confident we can find a source to replace sand,
Tabitha said.
Fine. 4 payloads. If it works how you want, we'll discuss how best to use it to map the entire anomaly,
the captain said. That was 2 more than she needed, but he didn't care about the number. He didn't even care about the sand. He just needed to look involved.
Nick, do you have our torpedoes ready?
Ready to fire,
Mick said from behind her. Tabitha took a deep breath. She spoke often of the captain's inexperience, but from time to time she was reminded of her own. She had served on multiple ships, but she had moved to covert ops before she reached command, so this was the first time she had actually ordered the ship to fire outside of a simulation.
Detonate the first torpedo at 10 kilometers from the anomaly,
Tabitha said. The explosion was bigger than she imagined. Mostly, that was because it had been configured to scatter the payload as much as possible.
Why are we shooting at literally nothing and missing?
Regan said.
Lumina optics sensors are exceptional at picking up radiation. So we scatter radiation and use that to map the surface of the anomaly.
The captain said. It was Tabitha's plan, but if someone wanted to ask a question, the person in command answered it, or gave the order for it to be answered to the person who best understood it.
Isn't that what we've been doing?
Regan asked.
It's about increasing the resolution. The radioactive material is hundreds of times more dense than what we've been scanning. So we should be able to map the edge better and see if the anomaly has a hard edge or if it gets denser as it nears the center.
Adrian said. It didn't take long for the material to begin to cross the barrier. The scanners showed what she expected. The edge of the anomaly was solid and perfectly smooth. And then it began to expand. It was slow at first, but every piece of sand that hit the edge was further out than the last, and each expansion was exponentially larger than the last. Tabitha barely had time to say,
Regan, get us away from here,
before the entire universe seemed to disappear in the blackness. A star appeared out of nowhere, and a single planet appeared on the sensors. Past that was nothing but an eternal blackness. Whatever the anomaly was, they had been pulled inside.
Get me some information, now,
the captain said. Tabitha checked the signals from the half-dozen probes they had sent into the anomaly. As she saw the scans, she said,
One probe is still active and it has. That can't be right.
What is it?
Adrian asked.
It has almost 400 years worth of data,
Tabitha said.
You did say, it seemed like we had been orbiting the anomaly forever,
the captain said, and as much as she hated it, the captain's relaxed tone seemed to calm the entire room.
I'd still like an explanation,
Tabitha said, trying and failing to match his tone.
Perhaps it's time dilation,
the captain said.
There are no gravity anomalies, and if it was a black hole, time should have been slower for the probe,
Tabitha said.
it's a trap.
Mick said from behind them. It had occurred to Tabitha as well, but she had been avoiding saying her concerns in front of the crew.
one that is almost impossible to find, not near anything, and ignored us until we were practically on top of it and actively sending things into it,
The captain said. That was when a ship appeared. It was half the size of the Endeavour and barely had a higher energy signal than a piece of metal that size would have had. Tabitha zoomed in on the ship and saw a mass of cogs, wires, and scraps of metal in the vague shape of a ship. It was flying toward the Endeavour with dozens of twisting metal tubes behind it, like a jellyfish shooting towards its prey. It was also where the probe's signal was coming from. And as it approached, the data transfer sped up. From beside her, the captain said,
I think we've seen enough. Regan, please take us out of the anomaly.
The movement of the ship was less smooth this time. That wasn't a mistake of piloting, it was simply understanding the situation required speed more than finesse. The Endeavour's lights flickered, not because of the power consumption but the AI. As it did, something else odd happened. A small red light began to pulse at the top of the screen. That was connected to the box in the engine room. They still hadn't been able to determine why it was there, so she had set up a program to tell her if anything changed. And it had just doubled its power usage. That was still barely enough to power a light bulb, but she noted it, and then moved on to more urgent issues. But within a few seconds, it was clear the Endeavour was faster than the cobbled-together ship, and the Endeavour's AI calmed itself. Then, once they were free, the captain said,
"Shouldn't we have passed through the edge of the anomaly already?"
I flew in the same direction we came from.
Regan said.
Just keep us going in one direction. We'll hit the edge eventually,
Tabitha said. Over the next few minutes, the Endeavour finished downloading the information from the probe, and the Endeavour's AI began to analyze the data. As it did, the lights flickered again. She glanced down at the screen, but there was no warning light this time. The data filled in slowly, but there wasn't much to fill in. A single dwarf star, and a planet close enough to it to be in the habitable zone. There didn't even appear to be any comets or asteroids. The only odd thing was that in the probe's sensor readings, the distance it was from both the planet and the sun seemed random. She was still watching the data when the captain said,
"There's another one."
Tabitha glanced at the probe data. It had already transferred, but the Endeavour was still getting the signal from the probe. And it was coming from the ship directly in front of them, so she said,
"That's not another one. That's the same ship."
If it could move fast enough to be in front of us, why would it let us get away?
Regan asked. She was still flying towards it.
"It didn't. We're in a pocket universe,"
the captain said, understanding what was happening without the stream of data that was in front of Tabitha, then added,
"Move us away from it, but once we're at range, match its speed so we don't circle back around on it."
That was easier said than done. It wasn't just that this was a tiny area of space, just big enough for a dwarf star, but that space-time didn't work the same as it did in their universe.
"If we can't fly away, we might as well investigate. Fly us toward the planet."
The other ship, while much slower than the Endeavour, understood this universe better, and so rather than follow them, moved away from them as fast as it could, and within minutes it was in front of them again, having circled the entire pocket universe.
"Someone try to get a message to that ship,"
the captain said, and Tabitha realized something at the exact moment he tapped the button to put up their active defenses, engaging the shields, and more importantly, turning on the ship's reversed gravity field. As it came on, she understood what was causing the oddities in the distances that the probe had picked up. Because as soon as the gravity was active, the space-time of this place twisted around them, and the other ship was practically on top of them. Regan reacted just fast enough to keep the two ships from smashing headlong into each other. But the other ship shot out long tentacle-like appendages, smashing into the crew quarters and latching onto the Endeavour. This time, when the light flickered, Tabitha wasn't certain if it was the ship's AI panicking or from the damage of the collision. But either way, she jumped to her feet and said,
"Mick, take the piloting station until the chief gets here. Regan, you're with me."
Regan was on her feet before the captain said,
"How many more pilots do you want?"
"A pilot and a gunner for each of the shuttles,"
Tabitha said, as she rushed out running as fast as she could towards the shuttle bay. That Regan kept up at all was impressive. Tabitha was genetically altered to have both superhuman stamina and strength, and she was using both. But though she was panting, Regan was only a couple of seconds behind. And as soon as she got onto the shuttle, Tabitha started the launch sequence. Luckily, Regan caught her breath fast enough to swing the shuttle wildly as soon as they were out of the bay doors, because a tentacle on the enemy ship nearly skewered the shuttle. Then, having taken over, Regan moved them far enough away from the enemy ship that they could attack safely. Tabitha focused on the shuttle's weapons. The weapons weren't as powerful as the weapons on the Endeavour, but they could cut through metal, and the enemy ship was inside the Endeavour's minimum engagement range, so the shuttle's weapons were the only real option. From this angle, she could see that the tentacles had claws at the end, and were already working to cut away pieces of the Endeavour. That explained why the ship had a probe inside it, and why it had come for the Endeavour. It was salvaging anything it could find. That would include the probes and likely the science ship that had been sent here as well. She aimed the first shot at the ship's core. The overlapping metal of the ship seemed makeshift enough that she might damage something important with one excellent shot. But the energy shield around the ship lit up as it stopped the laser. They needed torpedoes on the shuttles, even if they were small. But it was too late for that. The only option was to attack the tentacles. So she found one that was pulling at one of the Endeavor's exterior sensors and fired. The first shot missed, and her second was a glancing blow, but there was no sign of any type of energy shield, and her augmentations and the shuttle's targeting computers worked together, so each shot got closer than the last, and by the third, she hit the target. It partially disabled a single tentacle. And the only good news was that one of the other arms reached out and grabbed it, pulling it towards a large opening in the center of the ship. But even if all 4 shuttles could hit as accurately as she was, they would still lose a good chunk of the hull before they disabled enough of them to stop the attack.
Permission to do something very stupid, Commander,
Regan said. Tabitha didn't have any good ideas, and a stupid idea was better than watching the Endeavor be pulled apart and then starving to death on a shuttle, so she said.
Make it worth it.
The engine turned the shuttle, so they were once again faced toward the enemy ship's center. Tabitha began to charge the weapons. Regan had promised stupid, and so far she hadn't lied. Then the ensign did something the commander hadn't expected. She turned on the shuttle's active defenses. That included a reverse gravity field. It was a fraction of the power of the gravity that the Endeavor used in its defenses, mostly used to keep them from being hit by micrometeors and dust, but it was enough to twist the space-time of this place, and the shuttle jumped, moving half the distance to the other ship. Tabitha wasn't easy to impress, but she also hadn't explained her theory about gravity warping space-time, so Regan had worked it out herself and without most of the data that Tabitha had. Perhaps she was a better natural pilot than everyone assumed. But the ship was still shooting towards the enemy, and Tabitha realized it was only part of Regan's plan. She had promised she could get the Endeavor close enough to reach out and touch the anomaly. It should be even easier with a shuttle, and once they were inside the electromagnetic shields, the enemy ship's only defense would be its armor. So rather than waste energy shooting at the shield, she overcharged the weapons. That wasn't as dangerous as what Regan was doing, but it wasn't safe. If she overcharged them too much, they could explode. But even that might save the Endeavor. As the enemy ship filled the entire window, the ensign adjusted their trajectory to skim along the surface of the ship, and she reversed the engines to give Tabitha as much time to fire as she could. Hitting the ship wasn't hard. At this range, missing would have been more difficult. But hitting something worthwhile was still a trick. So she aimed at the open maw where it shoved the materials it gathered, and hoped there was something vital inside. She held the beam as long as she could. It wouldn't be long enough. The shuttle's weapon just wasn't powerful enough. Then Regan reversed the gravity field again. And just like the reverse gravity defenses had drawn them in, the gravity shunted them away. Not as far, but the shuttle was still braking as fast as possible, and it gave Tabitha and the weapons several more seconds. Any ship would have been badly damaged by direct energy weapons inside their shields, but this one had been barely held together. And as the shuttle fired, the ship in front of them began to explode. Regan spun the ship as she avoided the debris from the explosions, and Tabitha saw her end. Years of struggling to improve herself, to rise in power and authority in helix dynamics, and what would it mean? She'd die inside an anomaly, and no one would remember anything she did. But as soon as the shuttle wasn't about to hit the main part of the ship, Regan pushed the shuttle's engine to maximum. That would make it even harder to miss the debris, but she saw what Regan was doing. The excess power from the engine was being pushed into the ship's integrity fields and increasing the power on the reverse gravity. That kept the smaller pieces of debris from hitting them. It also bent space-time in ways that would make missing the bigger pieces significantly harder. But if all they had to avoid was the largest pieces of the enemy ship, they had a chance, and so Tabitha began to fire. She barely aimed at anything, as the surrounding field of debris jumped and shifted. But there were enough pieces that she hit something almost every time, and if she shot directly in front of them, it at least partially cleared the path. In her excitement, Tabitha actually laughed. Then she said,
Ensign, a few more missions like that, and you're going to end up getting yourself promoted right out of the job.
I'll be more careful in the future,
Regan said, the grin on her face making her look like a teenager. But as they flew back towards the Endeavour, Tabitha was reminded that they were still trapped inside an anomaly they didn't understand, except that she knew time passed much faster here. So even if the corporations sent a rescue ship, they would all die of old age long before help arrived. They were on their own. Author's note:
Over the last few weeks, I have felt the constraints of space, and so I have decided that for most of the stories, I will break it into at least 2 parts. That way, I can have more character moments, more action scenes, and more fun, while also being able to more fully explore the ideas in the story. I think that for this week, it has worked out well. And for those of you who don't want to wait until next week, the next story is already at patreon.com/Elton and available to all my patrons, along with dozens of patron-exclusive stories. Thank you. Elton Gar.